Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having a coffee, having a break after the initial session and coming back to our third edition of the Hydrogen Week and to the presentation of the Hydrogen Hero. Very pleased. Hello. The Hydrogen Hero. Yeah. We need heroes. And don't forget that there is a new edition of our Hydrogen Heroes book that came out this week. There he is, at least one hydrogen hero. But we will see many others today. Thank you very much. We will continue to set the scene and to explain where we are in Europe. And one of the best presenters of the technological and the economical situation of the European hydrogen industry is with us today. It's Martin Tengler. He's the head of hydrogen research at BloombergNEF. And he will now tell us where we are, if it's positive or negative. Martin, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Ergo. Hi, everyone. So 3 years ago, my colleague Meredith Annex, who was the head of the hydrogen team at BNEF at that time, said that the hydrogen industry is beginning to resemble the Gartner hype cycle, with the industry at that time headed towards a peak of inflated expectations, which is the first stage of this curve. And it was only a matter of time until it would start heading down towards the second part of the curve, which is a trough of disillusionment. And I saw that Jorgo has borrowed this slide earlier before me. Now, there's lots of data to support that the industry was very excited. In 2021, Europe spent offered to spend $70 billion on hydrogen. In 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. And that has led to the US and many other governments offering more than $100 billion for hydrogen in 2022 and in 2023 alone. Developers have followed this money. In 2023 alone, we saw 85 million metric tons worth of clean hydrogen projects being announced, which would be, if built, almost enough to replace all the gray hydrogen that we use today. So lots of excitement all the way to 2023. Now we're in 2024. And as Meredith said, we did begin to fall into that trough of disillusionment, again, looking at that data. In 2024 so far, we've seen much less funding announced. Much fewer projects have been announced. And the gulf between electrolyzer manufacturing on one hand and the demand for electrolyzers has been larger and larger, and we expect that it's only a matter of time before the electrolyzer industry begins to consolidate, starting in China, where this overcapacity is by far the biggest. Key policies like the US tax credits that President Biden passed in 2022 have yet to be finalized. And of course, now with the election of Donald Trump for a second term, there's a lot of uncertainty that could happen, although we don't think the US industry is in a bad spot, which I'll talk about later. And in Europe, policies that have been passed and finalized are being called into question, such as shown by that letter from Robert Habeck to the European Commission just a couple of months ago. All of which means that it really is no surprise that every day we look at the news, developers seem to be canceling projects. Now, we see two main challenges for the industry. Number one are high costs, and number two, caused by the high costs, is low demand for clean hydrogen. Starting with the costs, those have not only not come down as people have predicted or expected, including forecasters like my own BloombergNEF, they've actually gone up. Part of it is inflation, part of it are higher financing terms or higher interest rates, but most of it is developers suddenly realizing there's much more to an electrolyzer project than just the electrolyzer and the balance of plant. There are things like compression and nitrogen supply and lots of indirect costs, including contingencies, etc. So that has led to costs appearing to be higher than they have been in the past. Now, the good news is that we think these costs can come down by about 50% in 2050. The less good news is that that is a lot less than what we have thought they could come down by in the past. Previously, we used to think that the West would converge to the costs in China. Now we no longer think that's going to be possible. But there's one big assumption, which is that free trade remains. And that, as we know, with the election of Donald Trump and with the European Commission's move to limit the use of Chinese electrolyzers, might not necessarily be true. So we've come up with a second scenario that looks at what would happen if we had complete trade barriers, no trading allowed in electrolyzers, which we think is very, very unlikely to happen. But if it did, this is what the cost of electrolyzers would look like. So it's a very important question for policymakers to ask, how much are we willing to sacrifice on hydrogen demand in the name of protecting domestic champions, in the name of national security? And we don't have the answer at BNEF, but we think it's very important to be asking that question explicitly. The other part of the cost of hydrogen, of green hydrogen, is the operating cost of electricity being used to power the electrolyzer. And that has also been higher than what many have expected in the past, thanks to two reasons. Number one is we are seeing developers, instead of building renewables on site, we are seeing them opting for PPAs, typically powered by the grid. And PPAs, based on our database, tend to be about twice the price as the levelized cost of electricity built on site. And if you're using the grid, in some markets in particular, the grid fees can be quite high. So all of that combined shows that the costs that we're seeing in the market today, such as from the Hydrogen Bank auction results, are higher than what many have predicted just a couple years ago. That leads to challenge number two, which is low demand. Why buy something that's so expensive? If we look at the data from our hydrogen offtake database, where we track offtake agreements between companies, by April 2024, developers were planning to build 61 million metric tons worth of blue and mostly green hydrogen by the year 2030, but only 12% of that volume has identified an offtaker. And identified is a very generous word. In practice, only 11% of this 12% is binding offtake, so that's about 1% of that volume that I showed at the beginning, those 61 million tons. So that's where these cancellations and this disillusionment is coming from. Developers find it very difficult to get buyers. So that was a lot of negative news, but I do want to spend the second half of my presentation talking about some positive news and some signs that we are seeing at BNEF that we might be headed towards or potentially even away from that trough of disillusionment and up onto the third part of this curve, which is the slope of enlightenment. The first good news, and focusing on Europe now, and I'll focus on other markets later, is FIDs. FIDs in electrolyzers have quadrupled in 2023, grown 50% in 2024 by September, and we still had 4 months to go when this data was compiled. We see more than $360 billion globally committed to hydrogen by governments, and we think the European Union is probably the biggest, together with its member states, are the biggest supporters. Even bigger than the US, where it appears that a lot of funding is available, but it assumes that all the projects that have been announced come online and receive the highest possible tax credits, neither of which is likely to happen in practice. So lots of support in the EU. One superpower that we have here in the EU that we don't really have anywhere else in the world, with the exception of South Korea, are binding quotas for the use of hydrogen. So if it's expensive, we might as well force some industries that have no other choice but to decarbonize using clean hydrogen to start using it. And these quotas could drive somewhere between 2 million tons of green hydrogen in 2030 to 4 million tons in 2035. And these are already showing some promising results. Going back to that offtake database that I talked about earlier, about 40% or almost one half of the binding offtake that we've got in the database is coming from companies in the European Union and from the same sectors that are subject to those quotas that the European Union has set up. So we think that there's actually a very solid chance that the EU will be able to meet its quotas by the year 2030 with about 2.4 million metric tons of green hydrogen production and demand by 2030. So that's the lower end of these quotas. One final piece of the puzzle for the European Union, is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is essential to get hydrogen, green and blue and clean hydrogen, to start being used and competing with fossil fuels and with fossil-fueled hydrogen. But the problem right now is that the industries that could feasibly be using large volumes of clean hydrogen, like ammonia producers, are getting most of their allowances for free, which means the effective price they're paying was 0 in 2023 and is likely to be 0 in 2024. Now, the good news is that these free allowances are going to get phased out in 2026 to 2034 as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, gets phased in. And that should drive some economic adoption of hydrogen in addition to the quotas. Now, turning away from Europe and looking at other parts of the world, the US is the elephant in the room with the recent election of Donald Trump. There's a lot of negativity out there that I've heard. People are worried. People think this could be really bad. It could repeal the IRA. We actually don't think the IRA will be repealed, certainly not for hydrogen, because Republicans are big beneficiaries of the IRA. What we think is more likely for hydrogen is the rules that decide the conditions under which these tax credits can be claimed could get loosened. So actually, it might allow more projects to claim the credits, which means more money going into the hydrogen industry in the US. Now, not so good for the climate, because those projects will probably not be as clean as they otherwise would, but certainly good for the industry. If these credits stay, which, as I've said, we think they will, we expect to see some competitiveness for blue ammonia from the US imported into Europe from around 2030, assuming carbon prices of about $70, $80 per ton of CO2, effectively paid by the industry, so that's after accounting for free allowances. We could well see some imports of blue ammonia into the US in order to reduce that carbon price burden here in Europe, even if that blue ammonia is not classified as low carbon under the EU Delegated Act. Two more markets could absorb large volumes of US ammonia, mostly ammonia, and most likely blue ammonia, and that's Korea with its quotas, and Japan with its contracts for difference, each about 400,000 tons per year by 2030. So this is our view on what the market could look like in 2030. This is the optimistic forecast that we've produced. It's a bottom-up, project-by-project forecast. In the US, we see the US as being the leader in 2030 with 6 million tons per year of production, most of that blue, about 80% blue. Europe being second with 4 million, and China, a very big unknown, but we think there's going to be about 3 million tons of green hydrogen production per year in China by 2030 in the optimistic scenario. Lots of big error bars in China, though. And in China and Europe, both we see lots of green rather than blue. Now, there's some wild cards, and one important wild card we've already heard from today is India. India has set some relatively generous subsidies on the supply side, but what's really needed is demand incentives, and we know there are some soft quotas already in place for refineries, and those could become part of the law and could get expanded to other industries like ammonia production. And if that happens, there could be relatively large demand for green hydrogen in India. It's not just the federal government in India. There's states that are actively supporting or at least planning to support hydrogen. We know of 7 that have officially announced some sort of policy, and others are thinking about it or have not done so officially. One final point on India is the cost of producing and installing electrolyzers in India is quite low based on some preliminary data that we've got. Much lower than in Europe and only slightly higher than in China. So particularly if China continues to be limited by European or US or other governments, we might see an opening for Indian manufacturers. The second wild card is the Middle East. We know that the first H2 Global auction was won by an Egyptian project. And there are other projects in the Middle East that only if they can find a buyer, a binding off-taker, they will come online and they could produce hydrogen relatively competitively. So this is my second to last slide, a scorecard that we keep for the hydrogen industry. This is where we think we are at right now. We've got lots of supply ready to come online, if only there was some demand to take that hydrogen. So demand is the bottleneck caused by high costs. And what's needed is more policy support and incentives, things like those quotas and carbon prices, investment, and midstream, which I have not had time to talk about today. So to end on a positive note, we've certainly had quite a roller coaster in the hydrogen industry, going up to 2023. Now we're on the way down. But as I've shown, there are signs that we are emerging from that trough of disillusionment, and that final part of that curve, the plateau of productivity, might be closer than it appears. Thank you very much.
Martin, that was fantastic. I didn't promise too much, huh? And honestly, I didn't see his slides before, but we were quite aligned. So this is one of the best connoisseurs of the hydrogen business all over the world. Thanks very much. Keep your microphone on. We might have questions later on when we come to the discussion. Thanks very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to see where Europe has problems. It's good to see how to compare Europe with the rest of the globe. But it's interesting also to look into some cooperation of those countries in Europe that are basically committed to hydrogen from quite some time already. And I would like now to invite 3 distinguished friends to the stage that can give us an insight into the cooperation of Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, alphabetic order, and to explain a little bit how this works. I would first like to ask Katherina Reiche to come and to take a seat here. Katherina, I will tell a little bit about you. We know each other for many, many years. Katherina. Yeah. Katherina Reiche is the chair of the National Hydrogen Council in Germany. So she would advise the German government, although she has a quite strong political past. She was deputy minister. She was 17 years member of parliament and deputy minister in 2 different ministries. She belongs to the party that most probably will be the ruling party, one of the ruling parties in Germany after February's elections. And despite that fact that your party now is in opposition, you were advising the government, which is a strong signal into the direction that you might stay also in that role. And that's fantastic because in your private life, you are the CEO of Westenergie, which is also a strong player in energy. And you have been very, very strong and actively involved into hydrogen. I would also like to invite the chair of the National Council in the Netherlands called NL Hydrogen, Marcel Gallier, also a good friend. Welcome.
Thank you again.
Netherlands, very, very interesting case. Biggest hydrogen project, Holland Hydrogen 1 in Europe. Fantastic. And the guys who are running it, in this case Shell, are told by the government, listen, the cable from the wind park to your electrolyzer, you cannot build it, huh? Because under our law, it needs to be built by the TSO, which is called TenneT. Okay, then the government says to TenneT, and by the way, you need to ramp up the power grid. Huh? We saw in previous slides, we need much more power grids. It costs money. It's Dutch government, so very, very sensitive to money. So they say, take it from your customers. That's the customer. Quadrupled the price, 4 times the price for that cable. Shell says, not nice, difficult, but let's do it. And now comes the most important thing that goes to also to Martin's direction. How should the off-taker, Shell would use the hydrogen for the refinery? Obviously, the lowest hanging fruit. And then the government says, by the way, you don't get credits, Shell, for your green hydrogen. Huh? We don't like hydrogen in refineries. It causes a lock-in effect for combustion cars, so bad. How on earth? Marcel will tell us a little bit whether there is a movement. We have seen that the government, which still survived, has managed to convince the parliament to accept the refinery route. But this is Europe. This is our problem. In India, the prime minister just said, refineries you do. He doesn't even need a law. And we do the opposite. So just telling our problems. You can do advocacy like hell, but if some ministers don't get it, you have a problem. And we have this fragmented system with national governments. And the easiest of these 3 partners, Belgium, with always very easy coalition talks to build governments, will be represented by Tom Houtekiet, who is the CTO of, well, one of the biggest ports of Europe, definitely the 2nd biggest, port of Bruges, Antwerp. And I would like to give you now the floor to present to us this tripartite cooperation. Welcome.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Working? Hello, hello.
No? Could we have the mic for Tom, please?
Hello, hello. Yes, there we go. What an introduction. Thank you. What a fantastic presentation was this. I think it's not at all as we expected some years ago. Clearly, we came to some realism, but there is also a good thing into that, because we start to understand what will work, what will not work. It's not the big figures anymore or the big dreams. It really becomes to here and there to become a bit tangible. Our color was the orange color. We are working in the midstream. I think it's our role to work on cooperation and to make some things happen and to see how can we move some stones. And that's what we try to do. So in May this year at the World Hydrogen Council in Rotterdam, we decided, of course we prepared a bit, but we decided in fact to sign an agreement between the 3 of us, the NL Hydrogen, the Nationale Waterstofraad and the Belgian Hydrogen Council, and to sign an MOU. And for us, this MOU is not only a formal MOU, as we all sign a lot, but it's really a commitment which we want to take, which we want to write out, and you will hear about what we will try to achieve, because we are so convinced that those 3 countries together, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany, that we have to have one voice, that we need to speak the same language in order to develop that market in Europe and to develop that infrastructure for Europe. It's crucial to cooperate, yeah? And we are allies. Sometimes people think we can be competitors, but I don't think we are really allies at this moment, because it's every announcement which is taken wherever it is a terminal or a tender, is it in Rotterdam or in Antwerp, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to take a step, to make progress, because we can only win if we really generate critical mass. And that's why we need really to group together and to be strong and to build on that foundation, because we will become competitors. One day, when the important foundations are there, and this industry has become a commodity, of course we will be competitors, but that's okay. Today, it's not the case. We need to work together. That's, I think, the most important thing, because it's the only way if we really want, and it was referred to that, if we want really to transform our chemical industry and our steel industry, which is so essential, and to keep them here, I think cooperating and working for each other is the only way out, because it's really that chemical and steel industry and the overall industry, it's 30% of Europe's industry is in those 3 countries. 40% of the hydrogen consumption is in those 3 countries. So there is no other way. But we still have a lot of challenges. Let me refer to some of them. The first challenge is the competitiveness. Yeah? We are in a very difficult situation. And exactly those 2 industries, the chemical industry and the steel industry, is in very, very, very difficult situation today. And we ask them to do the impossible. So this is, of course, not working if they are in competition in global markets, in other regions, with other rules. And that's why we have to make sure that we take small steps, but keep our industry here. So we really need, as is mentioned already a lot, many times in the recent 2 months, I think, we have to go from a green deal to a clean industrial deal. There's no other way. And if we do see that, one of the last slides of America, the IRA will stay, and it will open. And it will open up, and there will be more. It will not be best hydrogen of the world, but it's important. It will be a step, and every step is we should engage and embrace. We have to work together to keep our industry here, to align on regular demands, of course. I think Mr. Minister Habeck recently in his note in September, he referred also to the difficulty of the additionality requirement. Yeah, and it's exactly, it doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make it easier to switch for companies. So that's the first challenge. How do we really balance change with competitiveness? And that's what we should align on. That's why, Marcel, I will leave you the floor, but that's why our position of the 3 countries on the refinery route should be the same. Should be the same, must be the same. The second one is on cross-border infrastructure. It's essential, of course, for Port of Rotterdam, for Port of Antwerp, to have a very good agreement, alignment with the German industry and the German ports, because we will be import hubs. Network is essential here. So it's not good if you do see some postponements also there, not only on the project, but for instance on Norway, Denmark, Germany connection. It doesn't help. So alignment on timelines. When do we want to have connection between both import ports of Europe and the German market, aligning and work for each other? That's also why we have signed this agreement. And the third one is on workforce retention. Also there's some bad signals. We want to have the best state-of-the-art industry. But if you do see that BASF for the first time in decades is really their population of their team workforce is going down, that it never happened before. So it does mean there are some signals that we really have to work on innovation, on a technology shift, not only to have the best state of the art, but also to be strong and have an export product later. So that's why also we need to align on that. So you do see more than sufficient topics on the agenda. We have tried to work it out in a 5-point action plan, and I think Marcel will first focus, and then Katherina will come later on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all, and really happy to be here, because it's crucial times actually now in Europe. Not only for Europe, but also on the hydrogen end. And that's also why I'm really happy that we're teaming up with countries that are alike, but also see the potential of green hydrogen, not as green hydrogen for a way of decarbonizing our economy, but also in a way to build the economy of the future here in Europe. And I think this is the opportunity that lies in front of us. At the same time, if we look at what has been presented by Bloomberg before, it shows that we're not in the right place right now. Reality is that deindustrialization is happening in Europe. If we look at the investments clearly shown, we do see investments here, but in general, the large investments in the industry, and I'm not talking about the hydrogen industry, but industry in general, is not happening in Europe. It's happening in the US due to the IRA and some of the other mechanisms, happening in the Middle East, happening in China, but to a large extent not here. Therefore, we see projects on the hydrogen side also delayed or postponed or even cancelled, and also that was presented. Also, we are still positive, but we need to change the narrative. Need to change the narrative from just hydrogen to decarbonize to a narrative of how are we going to build our sustainable, circular, bio-based economy here in Europe. And if you then look at the signals, we have a lot of the elements in our own hands here. We have renewable electricity, if you look at Europe in total. We have hydrogen production potential. We have the role of infrastructure, and Katherina will talk about that later. We have the offtake here, maybe not using green hydrogen today, but it's here. There's a large market, but there's also a large funding scheme. If you look at the overall perspective from member states and Europe, it surpasses what the US is doing. So we are actually in a good place, but not with the right setup. The other thing I want to highlight is that this is not a game of the Netherlands versus Spain or Germany versus Belgium. This is Europe against the Middle East, against China, against the US. Because in the end, it's not a question of if we decarbonize, if that new economy will be built, but it's a question of when, and it's a question of where. And if we can get our act together, we can also drive the investments here in Europe. And I think that is what this 5-point plan also encompasses, to really drive these investments here. But in order to do that, we need to radically reduce complexity. If you look at what we're doing in Europe, the Draghi report, I think everyone sees that as a good sign and a thing we need to move forward to. But the reality is that we have all individual member states driving their own policies, driving their own schemes, and not aligning their policies. And on top of that, we have a European policy. We really need to get our act together and drive towards a unified set of regulation and also policies, because that will be essential to drive investment. Look at the IRA. A simple number into a business case, application processes of months, that is completely different than what we see in Europe and what we see within the member states. So that's one, reducing that complexity. The other part is to really drive investments here, build that future economy, but also look at the other agenda, our making industry. A lot of electrolyzers need to be built in that future economy. Currently, the largest producers are in China, and if we keep a bit naive as we are today and try to drive renewable investments in the most competitive way, and we keep that policy, we push ourselves as Europe to invest and actually buy Chinese electrolyzers. And I'm not against Chinese electrolyzers, but I also think there's a great opportunity here to build a manufacturing industry here in Europe. But we need to support that industry as China is supporting theirs. In order to do that, we need to close the cost gap. Start investing, start to learn, start to reduce the cost structure, and we need the mechanisms from a European level unified to close that gap. So let me close on this one, because the other three will be handled by Katherina, but let me then finish in this way. I think as Europe we need to take the lead. I was in Norway and in Denmark last week, and you really see a momentum in a number of countries, and I think what we're doing here together with Germany and Belgium really shows that momentum in many of the countries in Europe. So let's together set that agenda. And also, I'm really proud and happy with the alignment we see between our countries, where we can together build that sustainable economy here in Europe together. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel, and thank you, Tom, and thanks to Jorgo, who gave us the stage today. It was pretty much 1 year ago, Tom, when we met at COP28, we both, and then with Marcel, and we met at the same stages, and we figured out, coming from nearly the same region, having the same interests, having problems and things to solve, which are pretty much the same. Highly energy-intensive industry, countries which are connected by energy infrastructures, power grids, gas grids, other sorts of grids. We should really join forces. And that's the day today, where we present ourselves as 3 hydrogen councils from 3 neighbor countries together with Jorgo at this Hydrogen Week. Marcel and Tom already referred on the statue of competitiveness. We have a re-elected president in the United States who will focus on strengthening the advantage, who will pull out all stop to further advance the competitiveness of the United States of America. He will focus on competitiveness, on a strong economy, on low inflation, and on leadership of technologies. And here's a place we have to stand up and join forces. It's not only the United States. Marcel mentioned also the Middle East, mentioned China. I could add Australia, far away, but still very decisive in playing a major role in the future hydrogen economy. And Europe has to speed up. Sometimes I have the feeling we take time, we sleep a little bit, and we make things more complicated than they should be. Europe has to speed up because our competitors, they don't sleep. What we have to do is focus on 3 points. First, infrastructure. Second, a close cooperation and coordination. And third, transnational strengthening of the existing industrial regions. When it comes to infrastructure, infrastructure is key. It is good that Europe, Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands focus on one part which is sometimes missing. When you think about the renewables, first there were the renewables and then the transmission line followed afterwards. Or we have the e-vehicles and then we focused and work on the charging infrastructure. Here we did a smart step, focus on infrastructure with a hydrogen backbone, but they are not only the pipelines. Pipelines are important, and we have to build a pan-European, robust infrastructure pipeline system. We have really an advantage compared to the US because our gas grids throughout the continent is really dense and capable. Infrastructure is much more than pipelines. It's about storage, it's about terminals, it's about ports. And this systemic view must be a guiding principle. Another booster is to finance the infrastructure for the upcoming future. it will take billions of euros to build the European hydrogen infrastructure. By 2050, costs are estimated to be between 1.4 and 2.4 trillion euros. That means the annual investment will be 50 to 100 million euros per year. That cannot be financed by public budget. We have to mobilize private capital. But for mobilizing private capital for infrastructure, we have to have an attractive framework. Second, we urgently need a close European cooperation. Too many European countries planning their own hydrogen strategies, their own hydrogen economies. It's like different islands. So my island, my hydrogen, my castle. That can't be a thinking for the future. And that was only one reason why we three joined forces. We need to build up a pan-European hydrogen economy. So the different national plans should up in an ideal world to a common European plan. And we need more exchange of knowledge. The knowledge is there. Technology is there. We have to use it properly together. To strengthen our industrial regions is a nucleus for a pan-European plan. Marcel mentioned, Tom also, the large energy-intensive industries are really on a severe struggle right now. It's steel, it's chemistry. All energy-intensive industry have to struggle with the current economic situation. But that is the point where we have to join forces. We have to strengthen the clusters as long as they are strong. The close cooperation between Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium, as we laid down in our MOU in spring this year, can be such a nucleus. The beginning of my brief statement, I spoke about a wake-up call. And let me address it directly to the EU Commission. My expectation to the EU Commission is end the over-regulation. We have to make things easier to remain competitiveness. Also, stop setting all the time constantly new goals and mostly unrealistic. The Green Deal will only exist if the European industry survives. And to everyone in this discussion here, please pull decisive levers in your own fields of interest. A cross-border hydrogen economy will help to bring Europe closer together. And it will enable European companies to remain internationally competitive, to secure our prosperity. This will shift Europe into a leading role and shows that the hydrogen economy is essentially a European idea. So let's work on making this idea come into reality.
Many thanks, Katherina. I think we should benefit from the situation to have you all three here and discuss a little bit one question that I'm really interested in, because in all three countries we have new governments, or we will see new governments very, very soon. And we understand that complexity is an issue. Now, the new European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen having a learning curve from the last 5 years, is committed to reduce complexity. At least she says so. So some of the arguments that you mentioned, the hourly correlation or bidding zones for importers. I mean, ask our Indian friends. They don't have bidding zones. They would love to import, but they cannot cope with that requirement. Or subsidies that cannot be piled up. This all are difficult, complex, bureaucratic burden that comes from the European side. Now, I would like to discuss with you what we can expect from the new governments. Because you all mentioned it. What will you do? Because you're advising the governments concretely to tell your governments, listen, Tom, you described BASF killing jobs, bringing them to China, 2,800 jobs, to say the number, goes from Ludwigshafen, not to Antwerp, where it could be, but directly to China. So what can we do to stop that development and at the same time to profit from the strengths that Martin Tengler in his fantastic presentation described? Can I ask with Marcel, because your government is already in place and survived last week?
Still, yes. Last week it could have looked a bit different, but things tend to change fairly quickly in the Netherlands. But yes, we have.
So complexity, how to kill it?
Yeah, let me give an example. You mentioned the refinery route in your opening statement of this session. It's an excellent and at the same time a bit of a sad example. Everyone, I would say, agrees here that a place where hydrogen is used already today, but then grey hydrogen, is the refinery. So the place where you can get to quick progress on the introduction of green hydrogen is in the refineries. So you do see that Europe gives the opportunity to implement legislation to drive that into local regulation. And here you see that in this case the Netherlands starts to develop its own mechanism, different than what is currently in place in Germany, where at this point in time we don't know and we find it difficult to calculate how that value of the refinery route we can incorporate in our financial models. Because in the end, you can only drive investments if you can incorporate these sets of regulation into your financial models. Because then the IRA, one number, very simple, you plug it into your number, you know, into your model, you know when you can apply, you know when you can get your approval, and then it's a done deal. Here we have so many different elements to take into account. It's the refinery route with a domestic system, different than in Germany, while our countries are very much connected, physically, but also, let's say, culturally. So one of the things we really would like to see, and that's also what we advise to the Dutch government, if we would like to do something on this end, please do it in a similar way as we're doing in Germany, hopefully also then doing in Belgium. If we can't find agreement even within these three countries, then it becomes even impossible on the European level. So let's take these countries as a start and build it from there.
I think in Belgium, Tine van der Straten, your energy minister, fell in love with hydrogen a little bit later. So she belongs to the Green Party. In the beginning, there was a little bit of resistance, but then she understood Belgium could be a front runner. And she was super good in implementing lots of things. Now, my question is, next government, what will it do? Will it learn, next government, will it learn from that experiences? Will it learn from the problems that the biggest port of Germany, Rotterdam, has had with that non-existing refinery route? What can we expect from your government?
So we are indeed in the formation of a new government. We had just the formation of a Flemish one. We are in the formation of a federal one. The good news is that we are Port of Antwerp, so we invited, in fact, everybody who has a say in future government, and we were able to explain what really needs to happen. And one of the points was indeed the refinery route. Please don't think to be smart, but just copy, and don't change anything what is the German system. Because, again, having aligned those policies will help, even if there are discussions between colors of parties of is it a lock-in or not, but please get it started. So that's one example. Second, we need also, of course, we need to have a voice also to Europe. We discussed also to Europe on the definitions. On the definitions, how do you go to clean? If you look already how we look today on CCUS versus 12 months ago, well, the same shift we need to have to go from green to clean. And this is happening. I think the opening is there on Europe, but it's exactly also what we want our policy or government to take with them and to write into as fast as we can in their local national legislations. They get some of it, but when it's come to funding, when it's come to funding, what is the willingness for them also to copy again the Netherlands system with a portfolio of 10 years, X million euro to create a window in H2 Global, still difficult. But we try to copy, just to copy.
But it's excellent that you mentioned this difficult regulation also on clean hydrogen, because the Norwegian government and the Norwegian players scrapped, not delayed, scrapped the pipeline on hydrogen from Norway to Germany because of exactly that, the missing simple regulatory framework in Germany. That caused a panic reaction of German Minister and Vice Chancellor Habeck, who was yesterday declared the Chancellor candidate of his party, which he might become, we don't know. However, the panic reaction was that on the definition of green hydrogen, he did a U-turn. So he was one of the ones promoting this hourly correlations and also green guy. No criticism, just describing what happened. Now U-turn as a panic reaction. What will be the next steps of the German government? I mean, we will have soon a new, well, May, elections in February, and then in May we might have the government. Do you think that in streamlining of what you three guys said here, we can be full of hope?
We can and we must. So without a proper framework, the energy transition will fail. So everybody is knowing right now, and our still in charge government started by still believing that there will be an all-electric world. So they had a steep learning curve, accepting that there have to be molecules and there have to be low carbon. And here's, I think, the crucial point. Think back 20 years ago when we started with renewable energies, renewable electricity. So we had the first windmills, we had the first PV cells. If we would have overlaid the first windmills with a complex framework we have right now, we won't have any kilowatt hours produced by PV, by sun, or by wind. Why the hell we think that an over-regulated framework for a not existing but developing industry value change could be a success story. So let's try, do the first steps, accept low carbon, and then get the further definition, but get it started. I much more in favor on the US system, which is not perfect, but paves the way, than an over-regulated, might be in future perfect system, which never starts. We have to think really pragmatic, having a phase-in of low carbon, working on a pragmatic definition, working on measurements, working on common infrastructures to get the thing started, and then making the regulations stricter, more precise, otherwise we would fail.
Best intention, enemy of the good. So, we now, I would like you to stay here. We now have the comfort of listening to Frank Wouters. He has another model to present to us how to bring up the hydrogen demand. Frank is the president of the MENA Hydrogen Alliance. MENA, Middle East, North Africa, huge region of production. And this is the man with 30 years of experience in that field. All the titles that are in my list, I cannot mention. It would take too much time. I give you the floor directly. And Martin, maybe you can comment after that shortly. Thank you very much. Frank Wouters.
Yes, thank you, Jorgo. Let me see whether my presentation works. Oh, fantastic. It does work. So I have two parts. First of all, I would like to commend you for staying with us this late in the day. The best we leave it to the last. And of course, this was a fantastic panel. I'll briefly touch upon some work that we've been doing on the role of storage, and then, what does that mean for Europe? Many things I do, but among many things, in addition to hydrogen, I'm actually also a board member of a fund manager in London that invests in battery systems. So you'll see a little bit later on batteries. I'm absolutely not biased. Last year, I started thinking, despite, Jorgo said that more than 30 years in what we now call the energy transition, I always had the feeling that I never really understood storage. So we started a project and we started doing a deep dive into the role of storage in the energy system. And I'm always a numbers guy. I like to understand it, and see an Excel sheet. So we started looking at like how much storage do we have? And to my big surprise, nobody knows. Well, we know now, but that was after we looked into it for about a year. But there is not an IEA, there is not an IRENA, there's not a McKinsey, there is nobody that actually looks at, okay, this is the amount of storage that we have that makes the energy system work. And it was hugely insightful because, when you understand storage a little bit better, you also understand how a system actually works. So we started with the overall energy demand, primary energy demand, about 168,000 terawatt hours. And a lot of that, as is, of course, not a big surprise, it's molecules. It's oil, the big one, then it's coal, then natural gas, and then we have electricity. This is, what we have at the moment. That is our energy system on a global level. And how much storage do we have? Of course, you have oil people. They know about oil. You have the gas people and the gold people, and you have the battery people, but nobody aggregated all of that. So we did that for you. It's a surprising large amount of oil. It's almost 10 billion barrels that are in tanks, in floating storage units, in gas stations, etc. 26.8% is in storage at any point in time. Coal, 20.6. It depends really where you are. In the US, they have, for example, next to all the coal-fired power stations, at least half a year of what they call burn, in storage, because they can afford it. In India, it's much less, so it really depends on where you are. Natural gas, more difficult to store, but also 13% at the peak time. And electricity, and this is interesting, so this is all pumped hydro, 0.03%. These are 9.5 terawatt hours. Overall storage amount is 28,500 terawatt hours. So you can really see that electricity storage. So once you've made an electron, it's really, really tiny, the storage amount. Several years ago, actually probably decades ago, I did a course on presentation, and somebody said, "Oh, you have to do metaphors and bring examples, and that sticks." So I went. Of course, it's 2024, so I went on AI, and I asked AI if you have something that's 0.03%, so it's like 3,000 times smaller than something else, and we make that little thing a golf ball. What is the other thing? So this is what AI came up with. So here's the golf ball, 4.3 centimeters. I said, I'm going to Brussels. So I asked AI, make a picture of a big sphere with the atomium inside, and this gives you an indication. So electricity storage, pumped hydro, and batteries is the golf ball. The molecules in storage is the atomium and the big circle around it. So that gives you an indication of where storage is. It is really molecules. And then you're thinking, at least we were thinking, electricity 17%, it's still 30,000 terawatt hours. It's a large amount. This is renewables, but it's also still conventional. It's hydro, it's everything, nuclear. With that tiny amount of storage, like how does that work? And the answer is relatively simple. Still, today, 60% of our electricity is generated using molecules. And the reason for that is molecules, you can store them relatively cheaply. It's easy to do. And it's unfortunately at the moment, of course, mostly fossil fuels. So that is where the problem is. And that is how the system works now and also in the future. Now, the reasons for storage, and this is, again, important because I'll get back to the second part of the presentation. Why do we have storage? First of all, it's technical, and this is what everybody understands. There's a mismatch between supply and demand. You know, you have, for example, if you're running a system on oil, then you have to dig up the oil in Saudi Arabia and then drag it all over the world to United States or wherever you have China. There is a storage element in there because you don't have a constant flow that runs all the time. So there is a very straightforward, simple reason for that. The second one is anxiety. This is also not insignificant. Of course, we've had price shocks in the 70s, the oil price shock recently in Ukraine, the gas price shock that Europe suffered from, and all of these things, they lead to anxiety, they lead to, governments falling over, of course, inflation, etc. So you have a strategic reserve to reduce the price shocks and also, have energy when you need it. So energy security is a big one. And then greed. I mean, if you're a trader, don't get offended. I just try to entertain a little bit. Of course, trade is important. People buy when it's cheap and then they sell when it's high, so trade also leads to storage of energy. It's important because only if you're looking at the future and how you model that, basically the only thing people take into account is the technical storage, and that's very little. So the storage that you need for energy security and for trade is never taken into account in energy modeling. So we wanted to know, going forward, what is the future? And we took a model that Irina did. We also looked at BP and several others, analyzed them. 50% direct use of electricity is where we think we're going to land. There's broad consensus that that's actually the number. So 50% electricity. So electricity is now around about 20, a little bit more, but it's going to go up. Electrification, big driver of the energy transition. There's a little bit of hydrogen, so the rest are molecules, biomass, fossil fuels, and some others, and others are district heating, etc. Then if you do the numbers, if you then add 0.03% batteries and pumped hydro, slightly more actually in the future because batteries are going to grow exponentially, it doesn't work. So the modeling is wrong. All the models that we looked at didn't account for storage, and storage is crucial. So we had to add molecules. And the molecules that we like that are compliant with climate action are clean molecules. So we need to think more about storage in the energy system because the three reasons why we have storage will not change in the future. We still have technical reasons for storage. We will have energy security concerns, and we will trade energy. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen in the future, and that is why we have to add clean molecules. In my case, we added hydrogen. And then if you do the aggregate numbers, then it actually looks rather similar to what we have today. 168,000 terawatt hours will go down slightly if we're a little bit more efficient to 148, so that doesn't change much. Storage is roughly about the same, but you have to add the molecules for the system to work. The percentage of electricity storage will go up. It'll go from 0.03 to 0.05. This is exponential growth of batteries. Batteries will become bigger than pumped hydro, but still insignificant in the bigger scheme of things. So molecules are what will run also in the future the energy system. We have to consider that it is going to be a lot more expensive. Batteries, actually, the 0.05% will cost $2.4 trillion of investment. So 13% of the overall storage capex will be, will need to spend on 0.05%. So it's insignificant, if you will. It's of course systemically important, but in the overall scheme of things, we need to think in molecules. Now, what does this mean for Europe? If you look at the European system, then we have two big strategic reserves. We have a strategic reserve for oil, IEA, that is part of what we need to do, 90 days of oil in storage, but we added natural gas. About it's 100 billion cubic meters of natural gas, which is more than a third of annual natural gas demand is in storage. It has to be 90% full on the 1st of November. So these are things that we have. What we're trying to do is start a hydrogen economy without a strategic reserve. Today, yesterday, tomorrow, we've been talking about offtake. Where's the offtake? Where's the business case? How come it takes so long for an FID to materialize, etc.? We will need a strategic reserve for hydrogen. There's absolutely no reason why we wouldn't have that, because you have it. You know, the Canadians, they have strategic reserve of maple syrup. I was just looking on my phone, somebody is advocating for a Bitcoin strategic reserve in Poland. You know, you have strategic reserves for everything. Hydrogen should have and will have a strategic reserve. If we start now, then we can actually provide a place where we can actually sell all the projects that Martin was talking about. The projects are there. The demand is a bit the problem. Why don't we start with a strategic reserve? And yeah, the numbers here will probably have a bit of a debate. 20 million tons is not feasible. Whether it's going to be 4 or 6.8. I've taken the upper limit. 6.8 would be what's legally binding, if you will, in the RED III. And then if you take 25% of that, then you are looking at 1.7 million tons. And that is a number that I think we can, you know, we should strive towards. Let's start with that strategic reserve. In 2030, 25% of projected demand, that's legally binding, you have a place to sell into. Now, how does that work? Just a few more slides. I think typically strategic reserves are for imports, because you don't want to be held hostage by, you know, an event that's not in your, you know, in your own territory. But if we would only do it based on the imports, we would disadvantage domestic production. So I do think we need to think both. I do think that it makes sense to have the strategic gas reserve as part of the TSO business. It allows the TSOs to actually do it and also pass on some of the cost as part of the regulated business. We do have a number of mechanisms. Aggregate EU is the European gas, you know, buying pool mechanism that has worked. European Hydrogen Bank is doing the domestic auctions, H2 Global, International. I think we have those mechanisms, and they've proven to be, they've learned from it. I think we can mobilize them for this. I do think that you need at least a 10-year offtake agreement. That means that if you need to have 1.7 million tons by 2030, of course that will then keep running, you know, if you have a 10-year demand. But obviously the market will grow, then also the strategic reserve will grow, and you can also sell from the reserve. It's not a static unit. And in terms of burden sharing, we have member states. You know, it cannot be that, let's say, only Germany or the Netherlands buy from that pool. We need to have national offtake quotas, so there's also a mechanism that you think about how to get the hydrogen back into the market. It doesn't come on its own. We need a hydrogen backbone. For example, the physical reserves. Germany has 42% of the potential for salt caverns in Europe. Sweden doesn't have any. Norway has potential offshore. The Netherlands has potential. France has potential. So you need to use that European potential for hydrogen storage by building a hydrogen backbone. That's absolutely crucial. We need to develop those storage facilities. I mean, we're talking 2030, right? This is 5 years from now. A salt cavern takes years to develop if it's not ready yet, so you really have to start and get going. So this is the number. And lastly, we also need to stop, or we don't need to stop. We have to continue building capacity to keep balancing supply and demand. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, simple. I think this is the job, especially the national quota on offtake for, well, Katherina, next coalition talks after February elections. This is very, very concrete, and you saw the numbers. Would it work? I would like Martin's comment here. Would this work? Is that something that in your objective view, because you are watching the world of hydrogen, could play a role and could be a Kickstarter?
So, really interesting proposal and a great presentation, Frank. I really, really enjoyed it, and great numbers. So for hydrogen, first, I ended my presentation with midstream saying I didn't have time to talk about it, but it's really, really important. So I absolutely agree. Hydrogen needs to be stored. Fossil fuels need to be stored in order for those three things you mentioned to happen. 1.7 million tons of hydrogen. If we say a salt cavern has, what, 10,000 tons, maybe that's a large one. So that's 170 salt caverns. I think there are right now 100 salt caverns for natural gas globally. So we're talking 1.7x the build-out of salt caverns globally compared to what we have today. So it would be a huge undertaking. It would certainly be a solution. One problem with hydrogen with offtake that electricity didn't have, solar and wind didn't have, is that there's no grid for hydrogen today, like there was for the electricity. So you could just connect to the grid with your solar panel, your wind turbine, and immediately this room was your customer and everybody else everywhere else in the world. But that's not the case for hydrogen, so that could be a really interesting solution. The paying for it is a really important question. I come from a country in Eastern Europe, Czech Republic. I know that Czech companies are not so keen, Czech government perhaps not so keen on the green transition. So would they be willing? That could be quite an unpopular move in terms of politics. So that would be something that would be really needing to take care of, especially if you're asking for national quotas for countries that are not so keen on the green transition in the first place. So that would be the one biggest challenge. Maybe it could be worked out. It could help solve some of that offtake problem. So yeah, something I'm mildly or cautiously optimistic on the idea, and certainly lots more to be fleshed out about it. But on balance, I really like the proposal and would love to hear more. And your numbers, I'm sure you didn't. Most of the numbers you've done, you probably have not shown in this presentation. And I would love to talk to you and hear more numbers and see that.
That's exactly why we are here, because we are now starting the networking evening. You hear already music. There are many receptions out there. I need to go now to open the reception at the Indian booth, our partner country. I would like to thank you. I would like to say possibly blending initially into an existing grid might also be an option, or for Poland, having a lot of caverns, offering these caverns to other countries that can afford. Poland could be a net winner. Czech Republic, maybe not so many caverns so far, but this is the point. These new ideas need to be implemented right now. Thanks for all of this. Thanks for the 3 cooperating member states, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, to go into this direction. And thanks to all of you staying with us. Stay tuned. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock, we continue the discussion here in that room. Now have a drink, discuss numbers, discuss hydrogen. Long live hydrogen!